Okay, that's great. We're just about ready to start. Welcome to Ask at the Cathedral. And for those, we record this and it goes out on YouTube as well. I hate having this camera thing here, but my name's David, and what we do is we look at an old book in the Bible called Ecclesiastes and see how it applies to modern life. And today is no exception. We're going to do that, and you'll find that it seems very unusual. It's not what you think when it comes to religion or Christianity. And the passage we're going to look at is, it seems a bit strange, but it's not strange. It's actually wonderful how it applies to our world. So that's what we're going to look at. There's opportunities to ask questions and so on as well, but I do welcome you here. Some people asked last week, I had a book called Magnificent Obsession, which basically looks at why Jesus is great, and if any of you would like a copy of that, please do speak to me at the end. And can I also apologise if my voice is a wee bit husky? I've had a cold, and all I can say is do not cough on a Sydney train nowadays, because people look at you as though you've got the plague. You know, I think I'd have been better off with a bomb coming out of my rucksack. So, mask up, don't cough, and you're all at a suitable distance from me, so if I do cough, you don't need to worry. But it is a cold. Remember days when there were colds and you could have them, and people didn't freak out? It is a cold. But we are going to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and I've asked Ruth, poor Ruth, I'm going to make her earn her keep today. We're just going to read a few verses in each bit and then talk about each bit, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. So if Ruth could start by reading verses 1 to 3.
So Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. Again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun.
Okay, you can tell this is going to be a cheerful lunchtime. Don't worry, it gets worse. I used to have a poster that was on my wall that said, things were bad, so they told me to smile, to cheer up, because things could get worse. So I did smile, I did cheer up, and things did get worse. And it's a very Scottish perspective on life, not this sunshine Australian one. But Socrates taught the examined life, the unexamined life, is not worth living. I think that's very important, because a lot of people don't want to think and don't want to examine their lives. And I think it's good to do that, at least every now and then. I also want to suggest to you there are 4 books for you to read. One, obviously I'm going to say the Bible. The other is the book of your own heart. The other is what we would call the book of nature. And the fourth is the book of humankind. Now, that's not just history, that's also psychology, politics, everything else. This particular book, Ecclesiastes, in many ways is quite a sad book. I like the blues music. The sky is crying, look at the tears roll down on me. I once went to the crossroads in Mississippi, in the Delta, where the famous blues singer was supposed to have met the devil and sold his soul to the devil to be able to play blues guitar. Well, when you see the conditions under which many of the cotton pickers worked, you realize how the blues came out. A lot of really good music comes out of pain. And here, in this passage, there are blues because of the injustice in the world, because of the futility of work, and because of loneliness. Now, I'm genuinely not here to make you depressed. I'm here to let you see, 1, this is how the world is, but 2, this is how it can be improved. So let's deal with this oppression first of all. Now, Solomon saw three things. Number one, he saw oppression and exploitation in government and in the law courts. He saw might overcoming right. And I was thinking there are numerous examples in the world of that. So if we step out the cathedral just now and you speak to the Falun Gong people, I think people look at them and think it's a bit strange, they're a bit strange, and what's all this about? But what's happened to the followers of Falun Gong, and I'm not one, but what's happened to them in China is absolutely appalling. Or think of the Uyghur people, or think of the people in Myanmar. Or the one that struck me, and it's no longer the case at the moment, but in Sudan, I remember thinking about this quite a lot. And the people of Darfur in Sudan, and when you read about it, you think, how is this possible? Over 350,000 Africans in Darfur were killed by the Arab militias there. They were raped, and it was encouraged by the government. You could do it, and it was encouraged by the government. And what Solomon is talking about here is pain and sorrow in the lives of innocent people. It is incredible how rape is an instrument of war. If you read Anthony Beevor's account of Berlin, the capture of Berlin by the Red Army. Now, what the Nazis did was horrific, but what the Red Army did was also horrific. It's estimated that up to 2 million women were raped repeatedly by the soldiers. It was used as a weapon of war. Children being kidnapped. And Solomon observes all of this, and he says there's no comfort from those who could and who should have offered comfort. There was no one to stand with them and no one to help them. And I go back to Darfur. Why did that happen? Well, the Chinese wanted the oil in Sudan, so they supported the government. The West didn't want to disrupt the peace in the South, so they supported the government. And the people were just left all on their own. And no solution is offered. Solomon doesn't offer a solution here. So how do we face the reality of oppression? Do we just shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's it, what can we do about it? We can't do anything about it. Well, from a Christian perspective, we don't have the right to turn away from the suffering of the oppressed. It's interesting, the Bible has some very interesting standards. So it talks, and you may think this is boring, it talks about high interest rates, or corrupt weights and measures, or oppressive estate agents. They're all mentioned. But you didn't know estate agents were mentioned in the Bible, but they are, and not in a good way. Same with tax collectors. Lawyers aren't particularly mentioned in a good way either, but there are some good things in there as well. And as he's considering all this, and he's considering all the evil under the sun, Solomon says, do you know this? This makes me so depressed, I think I'd rather be dead. It's like Job in Job chapter 3. May the day of my birth perish, and the night it was said a boy is born. That day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine upon it. May darkness and deep shadow claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. May blackness overwhelm its light. Imagine that, your birthday party. And that's the verse. You won't put that verse on a birthday card, will you? You know, you just wouldn't. It's just, may the day that I was born, let that be wiped out. I'm not celebrating my birthday. Or Jeremiah 20 verse 18. Why did I ever come out of the womb to see trouble and sorrow and to end my days in shame? It's fascinating how people say, do you know, the trouble with you Christians is it's all about being nice and just enjoying things, and you cover your eyes to the reality. This is not covering your eyes to the reality. I find it interesting how Buddhism deals with this subject of suffering. It argues also, the Buddha argued, that it would be better not to have been born than to have experienced oppression. Now, the Bible's answer is we deal with oppression. Now, but what it says is it's much more complicated than we realize. So, oppression stems out of the human heart. If you change the system, you're just going to end up creating a different form of oppression. You can't deal with oppression just through law. Law can restrain, but it cannot deal with the root cause. And we'll come on to that in a moment. So let's go on to verses 4 to 6, where he jumps to a different subject. It's what I would call the motivation of envy. And again, I'm going to ask Ruth to read it.
And I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. Better one handful with tranquility than 2 handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind.
It seems a very cynical observation, doesn't it? That you're motivated by envy. But you understand that. Let's suppose you work in an office and you're in sales, and your boss comes in and puts up a chart, and the person on the desk opposite you, they had the best sales for the last month. Are you not slightly tempted to try and compete with them? We are naturally competitive people. And this is where Solomon, he moves from the law courts, he moves from the marketplace, and he comes into the workplace, and here he sees envy. He sees someone who prospers and gets on well, and then people are jealous, and then that becomes a motivation for people to work. Now what Solomon does is he extols the virtues of hard work, but he's astounded at the motivation. In the competitive society, the motivation for work is often envy. Not the desire to produce something beautiful, not the desire to help people, but rather to compete and stay ahead of the game. I don't know if you ever watch, it's a dreadful sitcom, at least I thought it was. My wife loved it, called The Office, the American version. And I started watching it, and I just think it's hilarious now. I don't know what was wrong with me 5 years ago. I had no sense of humour. But since I've come to Australia, I've developed a sense of humour. And I think The Office is hilarious. But you see within that office politics, this sense of envy. And I'll let you into a wee secret. You see in the church, you get staff who are envious of one another. And worse, you get clergy who are envious of one another. My church is bigger than your church. Now, they wouldn't say it that way, but that's what they mean. They say, oh, the Lord has blessed us. And then you think, well, why hasn't he blessed me? And it can motivate you, and that's what he's saying here. He's saying that envy actually damages relationships. Oppression damages relationships, but so does that envy. Proverbs 14 verse 30, a heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. If you're in advertising, what are you trying to do? You're trying to get people to be envious, to want something that other people have, so that they will purchase. It's a huge motivating thing. We live in a capitalist society where the government want to reward risk takers, often those who take risks with other people's money, and competition. But what about the motivation for doing something because it is good, because it is beautiful, or because it is helpful, rather than just because it earns me more money or keeps me ahead of my neighbours? Covetousness, competition, and envy go together. Now then, you have a reaction to that, because it always happens. You get action and reaction. And you get a reaction here where in verse 5, Solomon talks about refusing to engage with life and society. And this is laziness. This is someone going, well, I'm not a capitalist, I don't work hard. Yeah, because you don't work at all. I stay in my bed, and the world owes me a living, and please could we have a universal income where people pay me for doing nothing? A little sleep, says Proverbs, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a bandit, and scarcity like an armed man. Now it's interesting. My parents are in their 80s, they're still alive. My father is in hospital at the moment, and my mother should be in hospital. I phoned her up the other day and said, Mum, how are you? She said, oh, I'm a bit sore. I said, what are you sore for? She said, I was out cutting the hedge and doing the chickens. I said, Mum, you're 85, you're not well, what are you doing? But I know I will never ever stop my mum working, because she's part of that generation, and particularly working class, saying, you got to earn your living. You got to do stuff. You've got to work. But there are some people, and it's a dreadful condition to be in actually, where you're just so lazy, you just can't be bothered. Solomon says, look, the hard-working guy's working for himself. The lazy man is living off others for pleasures. Which one is worse? Is there no other way? And he says, yes, there is. A better way than rivalry or envy or laziness is contentment. And that's why he says 1 handful is enough. 2 handfuls is more than we can cope with. It leads to chasing after the wind. It leads to futility and frustration. I remember a guy who came to see me once, and he said, I'm really struggling. I said, how are you struggling? He was working for an oil company, and he was earning, let's say, the equivalent of $250,000. And he says, I just can't live off that. I went, you're a single guy. You can't live off $250,000. I said, my dad has a quarter of that, and he's got a family of 5. Seriously? You can't live off $250,000? But you meet people like that. You meet people who have angst and who have stress because their second swimming pool is not being heated properly. Well, sometimes you learn that there is a contentment. Over life, one of the things that happens is you build things up. So we lived in what we called a manse, which was a church house, and after our children had left, there were 4 bedrooms. There was just the 2 of us. I had a study. There was lots of different things. And then we moved out here just for a sabbatical, and we stayed in someone's granny shed, is what I would call it. It was just 1 room. That was it. And we lived there for 3 months. It was brilliant. And after we did that, my wife said, we're going home. We're going to get rid of loads of stuff. And I agreed, apart from the books. That was the non-negotiable. We are not getting rid of the books. That's it. But then we realized how much stuff we'd actually accumulated and how much stuff you worry about. And we don't need to. Let's look at loneliness, verses 7 to 12.
Again I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil. Yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken.
Man all alone. Here, Solomon's describing he's moving from the law courts to the marketplace to travel. And here's someone who works hard, who makes money, but travels alone. What's he doing it for? Perhaps he never stops to think why he's doing it. It's the lonely, hard-working individual without companionship, without satisfaction. I was flying once. Remember days when you were allowed to fly? And I was in, I think it was a Continental plane, and I looked at their magazine, and I was amazed. It was a magazine for really wealthy people, and it was a kind of dating site for top business people. I just wanted to join it just for fun, just to see what it was like and what I would be offered. But it was so interesting reading the advert for it, because it basically said you work hard and you may be well off and you may be famous, but you don't have any family or friends. You're Johnny no-mates, and this passage here is not so much about marriage. Marriage can be incorporated in this, but it's about friendship. You'll know that Friends has had an anniversary, the program now. Friends is a very, very interesting program, the sitcom, in lots of ways. I don't think it really portrays the kind of in-depth friendship that's been spoken of here. I think you'd be better off with a program like let's say, band of brothers. Or, dare I say it, my knowledge of Australia was limited as a teenager to watching Neighbours. And this is what Australia is like. My parents, when they came to Australia, they went to the Neighbours set, because that's what you do. You go high culture. And the theme tune for Neighbours, when good neighbours become good friends. Well, I wonder if you are friends with your neighbours. I think of the incredible case. It had a big impact on me, actually. Hearing about a man who was discovered dead in his apartment because 4 weeks after he died, the smell was unbelievable. Imagine that. So lonely. So lonely. Talked about, here in this passage, talks about pits and coldness and bandits, which all face the ancient traveller, and all are referred to. He said, look, you're better off with a friend in these situations. When there's an accident, when we feel inadequate, when we're in trouble, then we do need friends. 2 are better than 1 for work. He even says, if you're cold, it's good to have a friend. In church on Sunday up in St. Thomas's, it was perishing. And I'm saying that as a Scotsman. And I said to people, people in the pew beside you, there were some pews that had heat and others that didn't. And you could tell the local people because they knew which ones were which. But I was quite amused because I said to somebody, just hug the person beside you, in a COVID-safe way, of course. I've no idea what a COVID-safe hug is, but apparently the British government know, because that's what they tell you to do. Hug COVID safely. But it's good to have a friend. It's good to keep warm. This is probably way too much information, but I can tell when it's cold in our house, because when I'm in bed, my wife wants to hug me. And that's because she doesn't have to get up and make a hot water bottle. I'm just there, and the cold feet let me know that she's feeling the cold. But that's way too much information, and those 1 or 2 of you here know her, so don't pass that on. If you're cold, though, it is good to have a friend, isn't it? In Galatians, Paul says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. You'll notice the increase, by the way, in number from 2 to 3. There's a sense in which the more friends, the better, though not in a Facebook way. I have 5,000 Facebook friends. Yeah, duh, so what? I have maybe 5 friends who, and what I mean by a friend is someone who you could phone up at 3 in the morning and they wouldn't really mind. How many friends do we really have, and how much time do we make up for friendship? I think it's a good idea to think about the quality of our friendships. And I think this image of 3 cords woven together is a beautiful picture of what real friendship is. When you find a real friend, keep them, because they're worth more than gold. All right, the last thing we look at is the fleetingness of achievement, verses 13 to 16.
Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king, who no longer knows how to heed a warning. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. There was no end to all the people who were before them, but those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind.
Okay, that's a passage that just needs a little unpacking. He now moves to politics, and it's a difficult passage both to translate and to understand. So what he's basically saying is, a king rises to power. He becomes complacent and foolish because he's alone, or at least he acts on his own and does not listen to his friends. His place ends up being taken by a young man who's climbed up the ladder of success from rags to riches, but that young man also finds that popularity was fleeting. So think if you're Barack Obama, you're the first black guy to be president of the United States, everything's going great, and you leave, and you cannot believe that a reality TV star takes your place. Now, I'm not making any political point, but it kind of would shake you up a little bit, wouldn't it? Oliver Cromwell, who took the British throne away from Charles I and established the Commonwealth, and is personally one of my heroes. and apologize to all of you who are royalists, but I'm Cromwell's my man. I really liked him. He said this: "Do not, when the crowds were cheering him, do not trust to the cheering, for these people would shout as much if you or I were going to be hanged." Cromwell understood crowd psychology. So, what is he saying here? He's saying something very, very simple. He's saying loneliness and isolation is part and parcel of human existence, especially for those who appear to be successful. And he's also saying this: the younger generation don't solve the problems of the older generation. And you should know that. We hear this all the time. Oh, if only we listen to youth. No, and not if only we listen to youth. The more things change, the more things stay the same. He's saying politics on its own is meaningless. I can understand to some degree why many people have turned away from religion. What I cannot understand is people who've made politics their religion. And I just see sometimes the passion involved in all of that. Now, what's the point of all this? Let me just put this all together, and then we'll maybe take some time for questions. Mark Twain says this: "We are on a plodding, sad pilgrimage, this pathetic drift between the eternities." All right, that's not the most cheerful thing. If we find oppression and injustice in the law courts, and we do. If we find envy in the workplace, and we do. If we find loneliness in our lives, and we do. And if we find insecurity, even when we reach the highest position, what is the point? Where will we find justice? I urge then, first of all, that requests, prayers, intercession and thanksgiving be made for everyone, wrote the Apostle Paul, for kings and all those in authorities, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. I do think it is possible to have justice. And I think it's possible to have justice to some degree, at least in this life. But you cannot have justice unless you have a just standard and an absolute standard. And here's the thing. I love this country. But this country was unquestionably founded upon what people call Judeo-Christian principles. If you remove that and you remove the roots, then you are going to lose the fruits. So when people say, well, okay, it was, or we accept that much of it was, and it wasn't perfect, it certainly wasn't perfect, lots of things wrong, but we're going to destroy that. I just want to simply ask, what are you going to replace it with? That's what I want to know. What are you going to replace it with? Where will I find contentment? That's the other question. I think we deal with oppression, by the way, and I do think Christians should be really, really concerned about the oppression. But this for me, again, was a personal thing. Those of you who were here last week, and we did put it up online, I mentioned about Auschwitz as we talked about Jordan Peterson's own burden on that. And for me, I was just stuck with this one question. There was a series on television called The World at War. It's an amazing series. Laurence Olivier narrating the Second World War, all in black and white. I think you can get it all on YouTube. And I just remember as a 12-year-old seeing a group of French Jews being herded into a barn in the middle of France, and the Nazi soldiers giving them a choice. They set the barn on fire and they could stay in the barn and burn to death, or they could come out and be shot. And I just remember thinking, why? And then I had this poster that I stuck on my wall, and it was of well, there were two posters. One was of a Vietnamese soldier being shot in the back, and his hands were up, and just the word "why" was there. But the other one was of the little girl. Do you remember this one, of the little girl on the bridge who'd been napalmed, and she was burning and crying? And again, it was why? Why? The little Vietnamese girl. Why? And it was that question that drove me to Christ, because I could see that without God, there could be no justice in the world. You couldn't rely on human beings to bring justice. Incidentally, that little girl is now a married woman in Canada, and she became a Christian, which is lovely. So, how do you deal with oppression? Where do I find contentment? I love this. This is Paul saying, I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I just ask you a very personal question. How content are you? I don't mean brain dead. I mean just how content. Do you know, some of your happiest memories are as a child when you get a Christmas present. Maybe you don't even remember this, but very young children, they will get something and it will be the most pathetic tiny thing. And they're just so delighted with it. And by the time you get to be 15 or 16, you're complaining that you haven't got a BMW. And by the time you get to 50, you're complaining that you haven't got a Porsche. It's just, how content are we? How do we get out of the rat race without being lazy or useless? Peace does not come from hard work, nor does it come from laziness. It comes from this, our relationship with God. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? So I'll leave you with this idea about friendship here, because I think this is the big question here. The question of companionship. The oppressed have no comforter, we found. There's a man or a woman without the companionship of family and friends, and there's a lonely king. So it's basically saying, I'm so lonely I could die. This is the ultimate blues song. I mean, I do like blues because blues sounds like blues. Country and western, by the way. Country and western sounds yeehaw and cheerful, but it's always about, divorcing my wife and killing my dog and drinking myself to death. But blues is just, I'm so lonely. I'm so lonely. Well, the early church talked about the threefold chord here as being the faith, hope, and love that Jesus brings. Ambrose spoke of Jesus Christ as the friend who sticks closer than a brother, as the one who lifts up the companion when he falls, as the one who warns us, and as the one who takes us from the prison to be a king. I think strength is gained from human relationships. We encourage and we help one another. But the greatest relationship and friendship of all is found in Jesus. He is the one who provides meaning and support and our reason for working. At one point Paul says, everything you do it for the Lord. So, I think part of what we're trying to do here is encourage people to think about the whole world and your whole life and everything, not just a little religious bit. But then say, okay, how does this all fit together? How do all the different pieces go in? And I would say, without exception, there isn't a person here who doesn't need Jesus Christ. And I know that's such a cliche for so many people, but it is such an important truth. And for me, I just find all the bits making sense. There are lots of puzzles in this world, but all the bits come in and make sense. Okay, we're going to, I'll look and see if I've got any questions on here. And I've got a job offer. No, I'm not going to take it. So if one of you was offering me a job, thank you, but no. I'm quite lonely doing what I'm doing, happy doing what I'm doing, rather. This is a great question. Sorry, I have to begin with this one because there's a few good questions here. Does contentment come from within? Well, yes and no. Contentment is how you feel within, but I think the reason for your contentment. So it does involve how you think, doesn't it? But you have to have a reason for being content. So there's a lovely phrase in Proverbs. By the way, I'd thoroughly recommend reading the Proverbs. They're kind of another of the wisdom books. And it says, better a meal of vegetables with love than a fatted calf with hatred. I like my meat. But basically it's saying, forget the barbecue if it's going to be served with hatred. And I'm not a vegetarian or a vegan, but I'd be better off having a vegetarian meal served with love. And by the way, there are some great vegetarian meals. I'm not decrying that. But I do think it's that contentment that comes. So I'll give you an example. Just again, going back to food. I remember a student invited us for a meal. And he was a young man, and he was a lovely young man, but he invited myself and my family for a meal, a Sunday lunch. And we used to do the Sunday roast and everything. And we went to his flat, and guess what we got? Baked beans on toast. It was all he could do. It was the absolute, one of the most wonderful meals I've ever had. Why? Because it was so kind of him, this young man, to offer this family who everyone thought we would give hospitality all the time. And he thought about it, and he gave us what he had. Maybe even what he could afford, certainly maybe what he could cook. And it was lovely. It was just, and it's that kind of contentment. And sometimes I look at people and I see they're so dissatisfied with all the things that they've got. And then you look at people and they're really content with what they have. And I think that contentment comes, it's a product, it's how we feel about things, but there have got to be reasons for it. And for me, ultimately, contentment comes externally from Christ. I like this one, sorry. What are we to think about woke solutions to oppression? Okay, I use the word woke a lot, and I shouldn't, and maybe I should explain it a little bit. Woke is a movement that initially started as something good, as these often do. The idea of being awakened to injustice, particularly in the African American community in the United States. But just as many things from the United States get exported, this got exported, and it's got exported in a way that has not been helpful. So woke now really comes to mean any kind of trendy cause that people have, and it is just getting more and more and more absurd. So woke solutions to oppression is basically, the solution is to oppress more. So I know somebody who is currently in trouble because they actually said, a woman, this is a woman, by the way, a feminist and a lesbian actually, and she said, women have female genitalia and men generally tend to be stronger. And she got suspended from her university for saying that. Well, because it might hurt or offend somebody. I always think that's such a daft criteria, because I would give up preaching straight away. I should normally, when I do these talks, just say to you, look, please don't be offended at anything unless I don't offend you, because it means you've just been left out. We get offended so quickly, and I don't think that there are woke solutions to oppression. In fact, they're making it much, much worse. I mean, let me give a practical example. Black Lives Matter. That's a great thing, isn't it? I mean, there's no doubt at all that there's been discrimination against black people, particularly in the United States, where this whole thing arose. But in the United Kingdom, and to some extent I think here in Australia, Black Lives Matter have made things a whole lot worse in terms of race relations. Because they see everything in terms of your skin colour and your race. And I think there's a lot of problems in that. Now, there are left-wing, there are right-wing solutions to oppression and dealing with things. None of it works unless we deal with the major problem, which, as we saw last week, Solzhenitsyn's very famous saying that the dividing line between good and evil goes right through the middle of every human heart. We have to deal with us. We have to deal with our heart and our problems. Another one here. How are we to build God-honouring friendships? Yeah. I mean, how to be a friend? There are people who are acquaintances that you have. There are people you use, people at work. There are people you like. For me, I think friends only begin to happen when you go through what I would call the relationship stitch. I may not look like it, but I did used to run long distances at some point. And I remember when you're running a marathon or something like that, I remember for me, at about a 2 mile mark, whatever that is in kilometres, at about the 2 mile mark, I'd get a stitch. And if I stopped, that was it. I would never get started again. But if I just kept going for 5 minutes through the pain barrier, then I could run forever. And I feel that in many friendships, I would say someone's not really your friend until you've had a disagreement or an argument, or even a fight. I used to say that to young couples who would come and ask for marriage, and I would say, have you ever had a fight? And they would say, no, and I'd say, okay, I'm not marrying you. Just wait till you have a fight and then see how you get on, and then we'll talk about it. Only half kidding, but your friends are people who can hurt you. Your friends are people who can cause you pain, but you stick with them. So that's one of the things about friends. You stick with your friends. You're honest with your friends. Friends are not just people that you use, but they're people who there's a kind of mutuality in terms of the relationship. Maybe one other thing in that, I think for any friendship to survive, there has to be a degree of forgiveness when things go wrong and when you do something that is wrong. And a degree, a degree of honesty. I was reminded of this week. I have a friend who's a very, very good friend. He and I, for a while, it's funny today, it's quite sad that you can't have male friends if you're a male without people questioning your sexuality, but he and I used to phone each other every single day, even when we both got married, and it was still the same thing. But I remember one time I was moving my apartment and I was engaged to Annabelle and we were moving stuff, and I used to have this cream suit that made me look like an American televangelist. I thought it was really cool, but it was as naff as you could be. Naffa is I don't know what the Australian word for that is, just means just dumb. So I had this cream suit, and I was quite proud of my cream suit. And anyway, we're loading stuff up onto the van to move. My friend is helping me, and he saw the cream suit come out, and there was a rubbish lorry, a dustbin lorry, going past, and he just lifted the suit and he threw it in the back of the lorry, and it got crunched up, and I'm going, what have you done to my suit? And my wife said, my wife-to-be, my fiancée, thank you so much, I've been trying to tell him, thank you so much. I was just, this is ridiculous. Do you know this? He did me a big favour. He was right. So a friend is someone who can take your best suit and throw it in the back of a rubbish lorry because it looks awful. Maybe that's not the definition of friend you would like, but that's it. Any questions or comments apart from that? I think that's all I've got on the phone at the moment. No? Okay. Great to see you all. I was going to say great to see you guys. You know how you address people nowadays? Going back to the woke thing, how difficult it is. I just got a letter from a friend who said they'd been told at work not to refer to ladies and gentlemen in speeches, but actually they have to say folks. So that includes everyone. And I said, well, what about if you don't like folk music? But anyway. But folks, it's been great to see you, and please join us again next week when we're going to look at something which is a little bit controversial, so I'm not going to tell the cathedral staff here, is what's the point of this building? And, how can we get near God, and does the cathedral help us at all, or is it a hindrance? So that's what we're going to look at next week. See you then.